So I'm going to do your session today on co-op forms. And if you've taken the time to look already, you'll notice that there are quite a few. And it can be very daunting, I think, when you are just starting off in co-op, when you look at the amount of paperwork that is required. But it is essential and it needs to be done. So I'll give you some tips maybe on how to alleviate some of the workload when it comes to the forms. So first of all, why are the forms so important? That really has to do with risk management. When you're putting a student out on a work site, you want to make sure, number one, that they are safe when they are there. So you need to do due diligence when it comes to placing students in the workplace to ensure their safety. There is a liability factor that goes along with placing students out on a work site. And basically, if your paperwork is not done, your RCE or say SFA could be held liable for anything that might occur with the student out on the work site. So you really want to make sure you get all of the paperwork done. Not every form has to do with safety per se, and not every form has a liability factor, but the majority of them do. So, you know, I remember when I was starting off as a co-op teacher at Yarmouth High School several years ago. You know, one of the big things was, you know, I'm not an expert. I don't know how to assess a work site, for example, in a garage. And you're not expected to be an expert in all those things. Obviously, you may need to educate yourself a bit on some work sites, but just keep in mind, you need to do due diligence and to the best of your ability, ensure that a student is safe on a work site. So before I start going through some of these forms with you, a few tips that I've shared with you on the screen. First off, if you're setting up a filing system at the start of the semester, it certainly does help. There are a lot of forms that need to be filed. So starting out at the beginning of the semester, once you have your class list, certainly helps. And it's highly recommended that you get yourself a filing cabinet because you need to keep files on all of your co-op students and they need to be kept for 6 years after the completion of the co-op credit. So one of the things that I have done with teachers, and this is something that's totally optional, is to set up a wall chart. Maybe you put it on your whiteboard. I have some printed at a local print shop. And it's essentially just a chart that helps you stay organized and the students as well. And you can have a list on that wall chart of things that you want the students to be mindful of, due dates for things. I can show you what one looks like at the end that I just recently revised and I'll have printed. If I have time, I'll show you what mine looks like. It's just a reminder, if you will, a big chart you can stick on the wall and it keeps everybody focused, I guess. Some people may find it kind of redundant because you do have a file checklist, but I think it helps the students stay focused and gives them reminders as well. There are a lot of forms that you have to fill out, but you can't really send them home blank. I know some teachers at the beginning of the semester think it might be easier to send them all home, get them signed right away. They need to contain all of the information about a student's co-op placement, so they need to be complete, all filled out. You'll see that on the bottom of several forms, it indicates that parents or guardians have to sign them and they have to be filed, and that the student has to have a copy, the school has to have a copy, and so does the host employer. So they need to be filled out in their entirety, so don't send them home blank. And when the student is ready to start their co-op placement, don't send a student out without their papers signed. All the papers have to come in. There are required papers that come in before they start their placement, and you need to have them in, especially the pre-placement assessment. There are implications if students go up to work and the paperwork hasn't been filed in the school in advance. And as I indicated already, and it is on the forms, on the file checklist, you have to keep the forms for 6 years after completion of the co-op credit. Triplicates. This is something that's totally optional, and I know not every regional center for education does this. I'm not sure if the CSAP does it, but you'd have to check with your youth pathways consultant. But there are some forms that you need to photocopy and make sure everybody gets a copy of them. And just to save a little bit of time, we have developed some triplicates in our regional center in Tri-County. And I'll, again, show you some of those at the end if there is time remaining. So if you are not the only co-op teacher in your school, and that does happen in a lot of schools, you may want to coordinate how you handle forms and filling them in with your other co-op teacher in your school. So as an example, when I taught at Yarmouth High, I did co-op for non-O2 students, and I also had some O2 students that I had in my class as well. So the O2 lead teacher and I would often hand back file folders back and forth because sometimes I'd be placing some of her students. So rather than starting 2 file folders for some O2 students, we would just hand them back and forth, and we had a similar system for filling them all in. So your YPC is there to help with forms and may ask to see yours. You know, time to time, we check on all the file folders to make sure everything's being filled in. And, you know, your YPC is there to help, not to critique. So if you're having difficulty with all the forms, or you need a little help with getting them organized and filling them in, then don't hesitate to ask your YPC. So the pre-placement assessment and the learning agreement, these are 2 documents, which I'll show you in a second, that are essential that you have them filled in and everybody has them signed before the student goes to work. And you sit down and do them with the employer. And it's highly advisable that the student is present when you do those forms. I think it helps alleviate, you know, the stress sometimes for a student heading out on a work site if they've never been there before. You know, if they can go with you that first time and hear all of the requirements of that co-op placement in advance, rather than just sending them there by themselves and telling them when they're starting and they've gone cold turkey, so to speak. You know, it's best that the student is there, if at all possible, for those 2 forms when they're filled out with an employer. So there are other forms that may be included in a file folder. Confidentiality agreement. So a student may go to a site where the employer has their own confidentiality agreement that the student is required to sign. Consent forms for field trips, etc. Any correspondence that happens between you and the employer, whether it was by email, for example, I mean, you should print that off and stick that in the file folder. So those are other forms that need to be filed as well. So you can access the co-op forms by going through the Moodle. And I know some of you are not yet set up in the Moodle because I recognize some of your names from the last session. So you can also access all of the forms on the department website. And I'm really sorry that I'm just going to be preaching to you for the remaining 20 minutes of our session. And I'm going to be scrolling back and forth. So forgive me for jumping around. So on the department website, if you scroll down to the bottom right-hand side, you'll see where it says co-op forms. And they're all listed there, and they're listed in alphabetical order. So the one that I'm going to start with, first of all, is the checklist. And sorry, I have to scroll my list really quickly here. File checklist right here. Okay, so this will guide you in what forms that you need to have filed for the student, which ones are required. And again, there is a note on the top telling you have to keep them for 6 years. So basically, there are forms that have to be completed before the student goes out. And I'm just going to start at the top. For non-O2 students, that's basically what I'm going to focus on today. Co-op is essentially the same for non-O2 students and O2 students, with the exception that an O2 student has an O2 application form in their file folder rather than the co-op application form, and their learning agreement is an O2 learning agreement as well as the co-op one. So this is your checklist. What I do with this in my regional center, and everybody may do this a little differently, is I have this checklist printed off on pocket file folders, and I give it to all the co-op teachers so that they can, inside at the beginning of the year, just file everything in very easily. You can just take this form and photocopy it and then maybe staple it on the front of a file folder and start your filing system that way. Again, it's just something optional that I do for teachers just to help them get organized with all of their forms. So I'm going to go through some of the things that are listed on here, and again, bear with me. I'm going to be jumping around a little bit from one form to another. And again, if I run out of time, I highly recommend that you go back and review some of these. There are two that I'm not going to mention today or review with you, and that's the image or media consent form. That is a standard form that a lot of regional centers in the CSFA use in order to take students' pictures and then put them out on social media or around your school. It's highly recommended. That's good PR if you take students' photos when they're at work. And I know in some schools, they have all the students fill out this form at the beginning of the school year, and it's kept in the office. So obviously, if you check at your school, if that's the case and it's already filed there, you don't have to do it again. That's a standard form. So that would be, you could ask your office admin at your school if you don't have that form. And the other thing I'm not going to go over with you today is the very last thing on that checklist, which is just any kind of correspondence from your employer, host employer, between the school, you, parents, for example. You may just want to print off some communication and file that in your file folder. So the other items on here, I'm going to go review them with you as best as I can. Okay, so starting off, and some of these things, I'm just going to scoot over them very quickly because I think there are some that are certainly very important for me to mention to you today. So the student application form, this is something that is a requirement for all students in co-op. They have to apply in order to get into the program. So this is the application form you can use. At the top, it gives a little guidance to the student who's filling it out, that they have to make sure that it's fully completed and it's signed. So you'll see at the bottom of this form, and you scoot all the way down, that it has to be signed by all parties. And again, at the bottom of every form, there is an indication of who gets a copy of it. So in this case, it goes in the co-op file at the school. So at the top, there's some general information for the student, just telling them they have to fill this out, have an interview. They have to be 16 before they start their co-op placement. They can come into co-op when they're 15, but once they start going out on a work site, they have to be 16. And they have to demonstrate the necessary maturity. So essentially, the students fill in this form. I'm not going to go through all the things on here, but essentially, you're getting a little background information on the student, what they are already interested in terms of career choices, maybe some employment volunteer experience that they have. There are two things on here that I'll just point out. These forms were updated recently, and one of the things that I really appreciate that is now on the application form is medical conditions. You will see under other information when you scroll down that it asks for medical conditions, and that is really important that you know if you have students who are diabetic, for example, or who carry an EpiPen due to allergies. It's really good to know that. The other thing that I like on here is students will indicate where they may want to go for their work placement. They may even give you a suggested name of the company they want to go with. And there's a place on here where they're going to check off whether or not they're flexible if they don't get their first choice of work placement. And I think it's really essential as a co-op teacher that you know that. I've had some students who don't get their first choice and then they want to quit co-op. And unfortunately, that can sometimes happen when they're really set on a particular career choice. But some careers are really difficult in rural areas, especially to find placements. And students, I think, need to be flexible. But some students are very set that they only want a particular placement. So for example, in Yarmouth, we do not have placements with the RCMP. And, you know, if you have a student coming into co-op and that's the only thing they're willing to consider and they're very closed-minded about that and not open to exploring other options, I think it's good that you know that and you tell them up front that you cannot place them in that field, because I think it's very disappointing for a student when they get into co-op and they don't get the placement that they want. You don't want them to quit later on. But it's good to know that you can certainly encourage them to be more flexible as well when you're interviewing them. So that's the application form. And again, if you notice on the bottom, it has to be signed by a parent or guardian when the student submits it. And again, as I indicated earlier, on the bottom, it tells you what you do with that copy. In this case, you just need to have one copy for the file. So that's the application form. There are references on here. And again, I'm just going to show you this quickly. There is a community reference and a teacher reference. They are identical except for the title. So students are asked to get 2 references when they apply for co-op, and the person filling them out, it's indicated on here that they should slide this reference into an envelope and have it returned to the co-op teacher. So those are compulsory things. Sometimes students will actually bring the references with them on the day of their interview. So that is the reference form. Okay, and it does indicate on here now, which I'm sure as a teacher you would indicate to a student anyway, not to ask a relative or a close friend to fill out the reference form. It's indicated on here as well. So that's the reference form. In terms of the interview, it's highly advisable that as a co-op teacher, when you are interviewing applicants, that you don't do it alone. There should be another interviewer with you, which is indicated on the top of this form, interviewer number 2. So have somebody interview with you, and you'll notice that there are several categories of questions you can ask during the interview, and it's suggested that in each category, in each section, that you pick a minimum of 2 questions. So it's a pretty standard record that you can use for the interview. I'll just point out 2 things. At the very bottom of the interview record, you will see that there's a section at the bottom where you can indicate if you're accepting the student into co-op, if you're giving them a conditional acceptance or they're not accepted. And just a reminder that if you are placing conditions on their acceptance, that you have to note what those conditions are on the interview record form. So for example, if you want to see an improvement in their current attendance at school before the new year rolls around, and that's a stipulation of your accepting them into the program, then you need to indicate that. And if for some reason you don't accept a student, then you need to tell them why it is they did not get accepted into co-op. And sometimes it has to do with behavior, poor attendance, a variety of things may influence your decision not to accept a student. So that's the interview record form. And those are all the things, I guess, that are kind of preliminary things that you do before you accept a student into co-op. So you've got a student into co-op, they've gone through the pre-placement instruction in class, and you're ready to put them out. The forms that need to be filled out before they can start are all on here. So I'm going to go through them, some of them very quickly, because I see I've got about 10 minutes. So the commitment agreement. Basically, the commitment agreement outlines the expectations that you and the school have for the student when they're out on a placement, and it's what they are going to commit to as a co-op student. Things like regular attendance at school, being responsible for their academic achievement. This is a form that I typically would give out at the very start of the semester with a student, and I would read it with them and explain anything in detail. So it's essentially the expectations that you have for the student as a co-op student. And you'll see that on the bottom, it has to be signed again. And on this form, you'll see that you have to have several copies of it after it's been signed, and you have to make sure you distribute them. And again, this is one of those forms that we turn into triplicates for the sake of saving time. So that's the commitment agreement that is given out before a student can go out on the work site, and you have to have that back in. There is also another very important form. It's the Readiness Form, Placement Readiness. And essentially, after the student has done the pre-placement instruction in class, you are basically signing off that you as the teacher feel very confident in placing them out in the work site. So this form has to be filled out, shared with the student, and you'll see on the bottom as well that it has to be shared with a parent or guardian. So there's a checklist at the top of things that you're checking off on. That student is 16, for example, they've completed all the pre-placement instruction, etc. It's all listed at the top. And then you'll notice that there are certain criteria that you're going to evaluate the student on, readiness indicators. So you're going to assess the student on each one of these points, and you're going to rate them on a scale from 1 to 4. And you're going to give your professional opinion as to whether or not you think the student is ready in terms of these criteria in order to go on our work placement. So you'll see in the list that there is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There is 8 criteria listed there, and you're going to score them. So the possible best score they can get obviously is 32. So you may ask yourself, well, what's the accepted score Do they have to make 16 out of 32 minimum? And no, I would not use that as an indication of whether or not you're going to sign off on them, whether or not they have a minimum of 16 on that. Again, use your professional judgment. There's some students that may score 18 over 32 and you're still going to sign off on them, just because you know that they are working on things like maybe their time management skills. They haven't aced them, but they're still working on them. So use your professional judgment when you fill out this form. And then you're going to sign off whether you think the student is ready to go to work or if you want to defer it. If there are certain things maybe that you want to ensure the student works on before you send them out. Maybe, for example, they haven't finished the in-class component instruction materials and they need to finish that first. So you may delay them going out on a work site if they're not done their in-class component, for example. So that is the readiness form. I'm sorry to be preaching to you and going through these rather quickly. So the learning agreement is another form that is on this list. And essentially, this is one of the two forms that you do when you take the student out. Hopefully they're with you. When you sit down with the employer and you get the details of the exact placement. So the learning agreement basically just outlines what everybody is responsible for, because this is kind of like a contract between you, the school, the family, the student, and the host. So this form basically just outlines what the expectations are for everybody involved in this whole arrangement of sending a student on a work site. So there's a section on here the student fills out, somebody from home would fill it out, and the host. So you can fill this form out with the host when you meet with them before this placement starts. So that is the learning agreement. So the next section of forms is really some of the, essential ones, the pre-placement assessment. And this is a very long form. And this is the one you sit down with the employer and the student, you fill out together. If you need more assistance with this one, I highly recommend that maybe you do a dry run with another co-op teacher who's been doing this for a while, or your YPC. But there are 3 videos that can help you with filling out a pre-placement assessment. They were mentioned in the last session. They're on the Moodle. There are 3 videos. One relates to culinary, one has to do with an office setting, and one has to do with manufacturing. And if you watch those videos, they'll give you tips on how to fill out this pre-placement assessment in those different scenarios. So basically, this is the form you fill out that gives a lot of the detail of the placement and the safety aspects of the placement. So that is why it's very important that you fill this out. So I'm just going to highlight a few things on here that I think are really important to know. The beginning of this form is just contact information. One thing I'll mention is the COQ. It's a certificate of qualification. If you're sending a student out with a journey person, such as an electrician, you need to have the host employer COQ. That is their number they get when they are registered as a certified journey person. They'll have a card, and it's really good to have that information, especially for the student, because they can use their hours from their placement towards an apprenticeship. So you need to have that person's certification number. Okay, so that's what the COQ is. There are all kinds of safety things that you will need to ask the employer that are all listed there. So these are things that, yes, some of the students in co-op may already have, such as WMIS, because you've put them through the course. But this is where you ask if it's a requirement of the placement. And if it is a requirement, for example, to have WMIS, then they will require a certificate. So keep that in mind. You might have to do follow-up afterwards and provide a photocopy of that. So these are all the things that you might ask that are related to health and safety. I'm not going to go through all of these in detail because I see I'm going to run out of time. One thing I'll point out on here that may be unfamiliar to you is MED DBS training. And that is a course students will take if they're going out, for example, on a lobster boat. It's a marine safety course. And contact your YPC about how you get a student in that course. Okay, it has to go through the YPC in your regional center or CSFA if you're going to enroll a student in that course. And the cost of that course, by the way, is covered by the Department of Ed. So those are some of the safety questions that you can ask. There is also more questions on the next page when it comes to training and orientation. A lot of this is pretty standard, and most work sites, for example, they're going to provide an orientation to the student and go over accident procedures. And if they're using any PPE, that they're going to actually be trained in how to use it. And their learning environment, these are questions that you can ask about where the student will be working, and keep in mind that some cases that environment changes, like if they're out with an electrician, they could be moving from site to site. But you do your best to know what the typical work site is like for the student and when you're asking these questions. Certificate of insurance, the school insurance program insures all co-op students on a work site, and sometimes employers will ask for a copy of that insurance. And your YPC can help you navigate the SIP website if you're not sure how to access the proof of insurance. So the learning agreement, we mentioned that already. Make sure you discuss that with the employer and it gets signed. You can mention as well with the employer that the student has to keep a track of their log of their hours. And the student will have what's called a learning plan, which I'm going to probably run out of time explaining to you. And placement contact by the teacher, make sure you reiterate with the host that you are going to contact them a minimum of 4 times during the length of the student's 80 hours on the work site. Of those 4 times, 2 of them must be in person, and you'll have to go out and visit the student, and the other 2 can be done by phone, text, or email. So make sure that that is mentioned to the host so they know that you will keep in touch with them when the student is out. Again, some more questions when it comes to safety. And additional training is on the last page. If the student, for example, has to do an orientation at the work site, then that should be listed on here. If the employer wants to do them, wants them to do a fall arrest course, for example, that it has to be indicated on the form. And a big thing that I should mention, it says it on here, is students are not allowed to operate or drive any vehicles on a work site. If they go into a construction site, they're not even allowed to move the vehicle, company vehicle, from the parking lot over to another building, for example. They are not allowed to operate a vehicle. Okay, and they're not allowed to work in confined spaces. And more detail can be provided on that if you talk to your YPC for specifics on that. But confined space is any space that is not meant for somebody to stay in long term. Generally, it's limited entry and exit, maybe only one way in, one way out. I can think of like an engine room on a fishing boat, for example, could be considered a confined space. Students are not permitted to go into those confined spaces. And then you'll see it's all signed on the bottom of this form. And I see I have 1 minute left. I had a feeling I was not going to get through all of this in the amount of time that we have left. One important document, not that they're not equally important, but the student learning plan is a compulsory form. This is in 2 parts, part A and B. It's essential that the student fills this out in order to get their credit. So take the time, please, and review that. Ask some questions of your YPC if anything is unclear. I'm sorry that I ran out of time, but I know it's 11 o'clock right now and there's another session about to begin. So I'm going to have to unfortunately stop there. Thank you.